Guys, a few weeks ago, Marbles from Mutable Instruments turned open source, and it was added to the Audible Instruments arsenal in VCVREC. So in this video, I will go through all of its features, we will build some patches together, and I promise you, you will fall in love with this module. So let's start. Okay, so here it is, Marbles, also known as the random sampler, and let's start by looking at what we are dealing with here. We can divide this module into three main parts: the gate generator on the left, the sample and hold section on the right, and the deja vu section on the upper part of the module. And let's start with the gates generator. We have an internal clock we can use and three outputs, T2 in the middle, which will be our constant clock, and two more outputs, T1 and T3, that according to the mode we are in will output gates in a different way, and we will go through the different modes in a second. We can change the rate of the clock by using this rate knob. We can take it higher or slower. And we can also change its rate by switching between three modes with using this button here. We can divide and multiply this clock. Yellow means times 1, so our original rate. We have also red, which means times 4. So the clock is being multiplied by 4. And also the green mode, which will divide our clock by 4. And we also have the clock input, so we can drive Marbles with an external clock of our choice. And then the rate knob becomes a clock divider or multiplier. So here I have the clock from JW, it's set on a different BPM. I will connect it to the clock input. And this will be our clock now. And the rate knob, with using the rate knob we can divide or multiply the clock. And of course also here we can use the different modes here. We also have the jitter function, which will add some human feel to the rhythm at lower settings. And at higher settings we can create really crazy, chaotic effects. And we also have the bias knob, which will control different parameters in different modes. So let's really start looking at those three modes. Okay, so the first mode, the green one, is really similar to branches, the Bernoulli gate and how it works. Marble will perform a sort of a coin toss, and this will decide from which output the gate will come out of, T1 or T3. And the main output, T2, will always output the normal steady gates. And with using the bias knob, we can change the probability of from which output will come out more or less gates. So let's start building a patch demonstrating this, and let's use the hi-hat module from Hora. And this is a good point to say that there will be a link to all the different patches we'll be building today, so feel free to download them and take a closer look. And let's add also an external clock to drive Marbles, because I will want to add more modules later and I want to make sure they are all running together. And for this we will use the simple clock from JW. And let's set the clock at around 130 beats per minute and connect it to Marbles, to the clock input of Marbles. Now from Marbles we will take T1 and T3 outputs and connect them to both trigger inputs of the hi-hat module. T1 will go to the normal trigger, to the closed hat trigger input, and T3 will go to the open hat trigger inputs. And let's see how this sounds like. Okay, now this is a bit too slow, so let's multiply the rate by 4, again by clicking this button here. That's better. And now by using the bias knob, we can change the amount of open heads and closed ones. To the left, there will be more closed heads. All the way, just closed heads. And to the right, more open. And all the way, just open heads. And of course, we can play with this live, but for now, let's leave it somewhere here. And let's also introduce some human feel to it by changing the jitter function. Again, lower settings, more humanized. And we can go also to extreme. But again, let's leave it for now somewhere here. And this was the first mode, again a sort of a Bernoulli gate mode. And let's add now another marbles. So I will duplicate this one and also initialize it. And let's connect this also to the clock and change the mode to the second mode, the yellow one. And in this mode, both outputs T1 and T3 will randomly change between clock dividers and multipliers. And again, the middle output T2 will always output the normal steady gates. So let's see what we can do here, and let's add the grid sequencer also from JW and the shift register from ML. And let's add also 2 FM operators. Now I know that I can use the sample and hold section of marbles to generate pitch information, but we are not quite there yet. So I will use the grid sequencer for now, and let's connect its CV output to the shift register and its gate output to the trigger input of the shift register, and send voltage to both oscillators. So I will take the first output to the first oscillator, and I will jump one output and take the third one to the second oscillator. And if you are not familiar with what the shift register does, I will put a link in the description to a video I made about it. So if you find it interesting, go check it out. But in general, the shift register samples the voltage coming in with each trigger it gets, just like a sample and hold does. But in this case, it also shifts this voltage through its 8 outputs, so we get 8 different variations from only one source. In this case, it's the grid sequencer. So now let's connect also both gate outputs of marbles to the gate inputs of our oscillators. T1 will go to the first oscillator, T3 will go to the second one. Let's also activate the level envelope. Take down the attack so it's nice and snappy. And let's also randomize the nodes of the grid sequencer and lower its range. And the middle gate output, the T2, will be the one that will run the grid sequencer from its random trigger input. So we will get always different notes, and let's see how this sounds like. So we will connect this to the mixer. And again with the bias knob we can change the settings and the ratios. And let's send also 2 outputs from the shift register to the feedback amount of both oscillators. So let's take this output and the 4th one, and let's raise the feedback amount also. So here with the bias knob to the left, which means that T1 will be more multiplied and T3 will be divided. And to the right, just the opposite. T3 will be multiplied and T1 will be divided. And what we can also do is randomize this bias function to get different results. And for this I will use kinks, also for mutable instruments. And I know I can use the X section of marbles, but again we will come to this point later in the video. So let's trigger kinks with our clock. and send its CV output to the bias CV input of marbles. Let's put this also in the center, in the middle. So now we get even more variation. Sometimes the first oscillator will be divided or multiplied, and sometimes the second oscillator will be again multiplied or divided. And let's add also some jitter. And what's cool about this here, that with adding jitter, the length of the gates is being also randomized. Let's look at this shortly on the scope. And let's take the T3 output, for example. So you can see the length of the gates is also being randomized. So let's take the sustain level here a bit down. So the length of the notes will also be varied and changed. And you can see how some gates are longer than other ones. And let's also add the hi-hat and listen to both of them. Very nice. Okay, now let's add another marbles and take a look at the third mode. So I will duplicate this one here. And let's initialize it and change it to mode number 3, the red one. And this mode acts very similar to grids or topograph from Valley as we know it in VCVREC. And again, the T2 output will output the normal steady clock. But with T1 and T3 we can create a sort of a kick and snare patterns, not necessarily just for drums by the way, and with the bias knob we can change those patterns. So again, let's connect it to our clock. And let's add first a steady bass sound using Chebyshev from Squinky Labs. And let's add also an ADSR module so we can control its amplitude. And connect the T2 gate, the steady one, to the gate input of the ADSR module, and the ADSR output to the envelope generator input of Chebyshev. Now let's add some harmonics, and I really recommend trying out this oscillator, it's really interesting. And let's add also some gain, and let's see how this sounds like. Take the octave down. Oh yeah. A bit more gain, a bit less gain. Very nice. Now let's add two more voices and use the T1 and T3 outputs. And for this we will use both macro oscillators, plaits and braids. And let's switch braids to plaque mode. There you are. And let's send now T1 and T3 triggers to both of them. So T1 will go to plaits and T3 will go to braids. And let's use two more outputs from the shift register to modulate their pitch. So let's take this output to the volt per octave input of plaits. And let's jump again one output and take it to braids. And let's listen to how this sounds like. And change the bias a bit. Again, with the bias we can change the patterns. And we can add also here some jitter, some human feel to all of it, or go totally chaotic. And let's listen to this with all the other sounds also we've created. Okay, so now let's move on to the right section of marbles, the sample and hold. So, the right side of marbles is in charge of the sample and hold section, which generates random voltages. We have three outputs, X1, X2 and X3, and they correspond to the gates generated on the left side. So X1 will sample at the rate of T1, X2 with T2, X3 with T3. Now we can also change this in the right click menu. So if you right click on marbles, we can see here internal X clock source. For now it's set up like we just saw, T1, X1, T2, X2, T3, X3, like we saw it now. We can also change it that T1 will drive all the outputs, or T2 will drive all the outputs, or T3, so you can choose whatever you want. And what we can also do, we can connect a clock to the clock input of this section, and then all three outputs will run together with this clock, regardless of the clock rate in the T section. We also have the steps knob, and let's add a scope shortly to see what we have here. With the steps knob, we can decide if we want full sample and hold at 12 o'clock like it is now. Turning the knob to the right will quantize the signal in different ways. So around 1 o'clock it will quantize in a chromatic scale, so we'll get all the notes. More to the right it will quantize to a scale that we can choose from the right click menu. We can choose major, minor, pentatonic and so on. And as much as we turn it more to the right, it will let fewer and fewer notes through until all the way to the right we will get just the octaves. So we will get only the octaves of the scale. And if we turn it to the left, we will get a smooth signal, a sort of a slewed signal, perfect for all sorts of modulation. You can see how it's running. Now with this button here, we can change the range of the signals. We have 0 to positive 5 volt, like it is now. Negative, positive 5 volts, the red mode here, so we have a bipolar signal. And 0 to positive 2 volts, the green mode, which is perfect for pitch modulation, since 2 volts means 2 octaves. And with the spread and bias knobs, we can change the range even further. With the spread knob, let's change it again to the red mode, negative, positive 5 volts. With the spread knob, we can change the distance the signal jumps with each sample. To the left, we can decrease this signal. And to the right, of course, we can increase it until we turn it all the way to the right, and then we get just the minimum and maximum voltages, so we get actually random gates with random lengths. Now the bias knob allows us to sort of offset the range up or down. So if I take, for example, the spread knob all the way to the left, it will not spread the signal and we will stay in the middle. And you can see when I turn the bias knob to the left, the voltage will go down, and if I turn it to the right, it will go up. So if the spread knob is in the middle, we can decide where the middle voltage will be, and from there the notes will be, or the signal will be spreaded. Now also here we have 3 modes, this time a bit more experimental. The first mode, the green one, means that all 3 outputs are working according to what you set up, like steps and bias. The second mode, the yellow one, means that just the middle output X2 will work as expected, but the other 2 will do exactly the opposite. So if we quantize the signal, for example, just X2 will be quantized, and X1 and X3 will output a smooth signal. As you can see here, it's doing exactly the opposite of what we set up here. And the third mode, the red one, means that X3 is working as expected. Let's connect it to the scope. So it will be quantized in this case. X1 will be the opposite of it. So you can see it's slewed. And X2 will work as if all the different settings are in the center. So never mind how we set it up. It will work like all the knobs are in the center. Like I said, it's a bit experimental, but can yield interesting results. Let's look also shortly at the Y output before we move on to building a patch. So let's connect it shortly to the scope. The Y output is also a CV output, which will follow the main clock or the clock coming in the clock input. It will also follow the steps and bias and spread. And we can also set a different clock division just for this output in the right-click menu. So we have Y divider ratio, and now it's set on quarter. We can change it to whatever we want. Let's set it now to half, for example. So it will run at half time, or it will sample at half time, then our rate. So now let's initialize marbles, get rid of the scope, and start building a patch. We will use our clock here to run marbles, so we will connect it to the clock input. And let's change its mode to the second mode, the yellow one, clock division and multiplication. We will use 3 FM operators. And let's connect the gate outputs to the gate inputs of the oscillators, so T1 to the first oscillator, T2 to the second one, and so on. Let's activate also the level envelopes and take the attack all the way down so we have something nice and snappy. And the CV outputs we will send to the volt per octave input, so again X1 to the first oscillator and so on. Let's change also the scale of marbles to a minor scale and the voltage range to 0 to positive 2 volts, again because we are modulating pitch. And let's see how this sounds like. Let me just connect this to the mixer. And let's play around a bit with the spread, bias and steps knob. So first of all, let's quantize the signal. If we turn this to the right, the signal will be quantized and we will get a minor scale. And let's play a bit with the spread. If I take it again all the way up, we will get just the minimum and the maximum voltages. So let's turn it a bit down and the bias also a bit down so we get more lower notes. And what we can also do is to modulate the bias of the T section with the Y output. So if I turn this to the left again, we will get more interesting rhythms. So let's modulate this with the Y output here. And let's turn it a bit to the left because it's just positive voltage. It will go from this point onward. So let's turn it a bit to the left and this will modulate the bias function. Very nice. Now let's add also some jitter. Again, lower settings, it's more of a human feel. And we can go also to extremes. Which is also interesting, but let's leave it for now here. And let's also modulate the feedback amount of the oscillators with those CV outputs. So I will just make the connections here and raise the feedback amount of each oscillator. Very nice. Okay, so now that we have this, let's add some more voices. So I will just mute this for a second. And we will use another marbles. And let's initialize it also. And again, connect it to our clock. But this time we will multiply this clock by turning the rate knob to about 3 o'clock. So again, when there is a clock connected to the clock input, the rate knob becomes a clock divider or multiplier. So let's multiply the clock at around 3 o'clock. And let's change the mode also to the third mode, the red one, which is similar to the topograph or grids. And let's use 2 plaits as our sound source. And also add 2 pitch tools modules, again 21 kHz. Let's make this here nice and tidy. Let's add another one. And change the one to 7 semitones higher in pitch. And the other one we will leave like this, but both of them we will take 1 octave lower. And now we can connect T1 and T3 to trigger both oscillators, and the X1 and X3 to modulate their pitch, again through the Pitch Tools modules. And again, the X outputs will sample at the rate of the T outputs, and let's also turn the steps knob all the way to the right, so we will get just the octaves and no notes in between, and change also the scale here to minor, so we have the same scale as the first marbles. And let's see how this sounds like, so again I will connect it to the mixer. And let's turn the bias all the way right. Very nice. Now again we can play a bit with the settings of the spread and bias. And let's change also the range already to 0 to positive 2 volts. Let's lower the spread and let's raise the bias a bit. And let's use this time the Y output to modulate the jitter function. Let's take it a bit up. Oh yeah. Let's listen to all together also with the other voices. Very nice. Now we can use these marbles to add also some hi-hats, and for this we will use again kinks, also mutable instruments, and let's use also Spank from Volt. It's a really snappy envelope generator with a built-in VCA, so it's really good for percussive sound. So let's send noise from kinks to the input of the VCA. Let's change also the envelope to hard, so it's really nice and snappy. Turn the decay all the way down, and let's use the T2 output to trigger the envelope, and the X2 output to modulate the decay. Let's open the attenuator just a bit, and let's listen to this. Very nice. And let's add quickly another voice. Let's add a bass, so we will use another marbles, and I will again initialize it. And let's use for this the palm loop oscillator, also 21 kHz, and also tangents. And let's use also the slew limiter from Befaco, so we can get a sort of portamento or glide. And let's use the same clock for to drive marbles. And let's turn the bias of the X section all the way down, so we get more lower notes, and the spread to around 9 o'clock. And we will use the X1 output to change the pitch of the oscillator, and let's run it first through the slew limiter, of course. And let's raise the, let's call it attack and decay. So now we get a nice glide between the notes, and because marbles is on a Bernoulli gate mode, the green one, we will change the bias to around 3 o'clock. So the change in pitch will not happen so often. Again, bias in this mode is a probability. So we will get more notes or more triggers out of T3 and not out of T1. And X1 is running or sampling at the rate of T1. So again, less change in notes. And let's here also change the scale of marbles again to minor, and the steps function, so the signal will be quantized. And now let's send a sawtooth wave through tangents to the mixer and a sine wave directly to the mixer. This sine wave is 1 octave lower than this sawtooth wave. Let's lower the octave one octave down. More resonance, less cutoff. Yes, 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 yes. And let's quickly also modulate the cutoff point so we can use the BPM LFO from Frozen Wastelands. And let's use the T2 output as our clock to this LFO and divide it by 64. Take a triangle wave to the CV input of the cutoff and open the attenuator just a bit. Very nice. Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to the Deja Vu section and then look at some more cool and funky things we can do with marbles. So the Deja Vu section is very similar to how the Turing machine works. We can lock the sequence for the T section and for the X section separately by using these buttons here. And we can set the sequence length with this knob. Now by turning the Deja Vu knob, we can start adding variations to the locked sequence by turning it to the left. We start letting new information in, just like with the Turing machine, and all the way to the left, it's like the sequence is not really locked. And by turning it to the right, and this is where it gets interesting, we don't let new information in, but rather start jumping within the locked sequence and the information we already have, like voltages and gates, so we can lock a certain sequence and still have some sort of variation. We can also modulate the Deja Vu function using its dedicated CV input, which also allows us to control it with external gear and play it live. So let's build a small patch to demonstrate how this function works and sounds like. And for this we will use 3 braids modules in pluck mode, so I will change the first one to pluck and duplicate it. And let's trigger them with 3 T outputs, the first 2 with T1 and T3, and the third oscillator with T2. And let's change the mode of marbles to the second one, the yellow mode, and turn the bias a bit to the left. And change the scale of marbles to minor, because it's much more fun. And let's use also the Y output to modulate the bias of the T section, and set the range of voltage to 0 to positive 2 volts, the green mode here. Let's quantize also the signals. And now let's listen to how this sounds like. Connect also the voltages, the pitch information. Very nice. So now we can start locking the sequence. So let me just initialize this here. And let's lock the sequence. And now it's on one step. This is why it sounds like this. But let's try to take it, turn the knob a bit to the left and enter some, let some new information in. Maybe a bit less. So you can hear it's really slowly starting to let more information, new information in the sequence, in the locked sequence. And if I turn it more to the left, we get more new information. Again, like change in voltages and clock division. And if I turn it to the right, so this is again the locked sequence, and if I turn it to the right, it will not let new information in, but it will jump within the sequence and move stuff around. So let's set it to, let's say, 5 steps here in the middle. So it's still locked, the sequence is still locked, but it's moving stuff around within the sequence. And even when the sequence is locked, we can still play with the different settings here. So we can, let's say, lower the spread and the bias. We can add some jitter. Let's make this a bit quicker even. And we can lock also just the X section. Let's make this a bit more snappy. Or we can lock just the T section. So the notes will change now, but not the patterns. Or we can let new information in. Very nice. So this was the Deja Vu section, and let's look at some other funky stuff we can do with marbles and start with using external voltage. So first of all, let's see how we can use voltage coming from a different sequencer in marbles, which means that we can use all the different features of marbles to change and control this voltage. And let's use ions for this from the Geodesics collection. Let's change it, of course, to the dark side. And let's play a bit with the level of each step. And set the probability knob all the way up so we get a 16-step sequence. And let's use again the clock from JW once to run ions and also to drive marbles. Now in marbles, and let me zoom in a bit so we can see this, in marbles above the spread CV input, you can see this here, there is an entrance sign, which means that this is the input we will use for sending the external voltage. So let's connect ions to this input. We will take the blue sequence, let's say. And by clicking this button here, you can see here there is also the same sign. We activate the external signal mode, and now marbles will process and use the voltage coming in this input. In this case, the voltage coming in from ions. So let's zoom out again and add an oscillator, and we will use again Chebyshev from Squinky Labs. And let's use the X2 output to control its pitch, and the X1 output to control its gain and open the attenuator. And let's use also the Y output and the X3 output to modulate the first two harmonics of Chebyshev. And now we can listen to this, and of course, first of all, we have to quantize the signal. Let's take it one octave lower. So we'll quantize the signal. And let's change the scale also to a minor key because it's much more fun. And lower the spread and bias. Let's open that gain attenuator just a bit more, yeah. So now marbles is sampling the voltage coming in from ions, and like you've seen, we can change the settings in marbles to affect how this voltage is being processed. So let's add also some jitter. And we can also lock the sequence. Very nice. Now of course we can also use audio rate signals for this. So let's mute this for a second and add another marbles and initialize it. Let's put it here for a second and let's use the new oscillator from Vult, Basel, and use the same X2 output from before to modulate its pitch, and X1 and X3 to modulate its modulations. And let's open the attenuator. Now let's send Basel to the spread CV input of marbles and activate the external source mode. So now marbles will process the signal coming in from Basel, And actually for processing audio rate signals, we will need a much faster sample rate. So the rate of the clock should be much faster and multiplied by 4, the red mode here. And actually even this is not enough, so let's use also the offset module from Boog Audio to push the rate even higher. So let's connect the output to the rate CV input of Marbles, and let's raise the offset to about this level here, and send X1 and X3 to the mixer, and let's listen to this. So there is nothing special about it, but again, we can use all the different features of Marbles and mess around with the sound even more. So let's first quantize the signal. And you can hear it's much more fuzzy already, and play with the spread and bias. We can also lock the sequence and create even more weird effects. Even more grit to the sound. Maybe some jitter also. Okay, very nice. And let's see also how to use Marbles as an oscillator. So let's add another Marbles, and I will initialize it also. Let's move this here so we have some space. And for this again, we will multiply the clock by 4. And now we can tune it just like an oscillator. So let's use Hot Tuna from Nischi, which is a tuner, and send the T2 output to the tuner. And now we can tune the note or raise the rate until we go to C3. And of course, you can tune it to any note you like, but in this case, C3 works just fine. So let's get rid of the tuner. And now we can send pitch information to its rate CV input from the X2 output of the first Marbles. And this rate CV input will follow 1 volt per octave, so it will stay in tune. Let's use also tangents again, and send the T2 output through tangents to the mixer. Let's raise a bit the resonance of tangents, close a bit the cutoff point. And let's modulate actually the cutoff point with the same X2 output from the first Marbles and open the attenuator a bit. So again, higher notes, more voltage, the cutoff is open. Now again, nothing is special until we start messing around with the parameters. So let's see how it sounds like with some jitter, for example. And let's actually modulate the jitter function with the Y output. So let's see, let's lower the spread a bit and the bias and change it to 0 to positive 2 volts and send the Y output to the jitter CV input. And let's make it more of a smooth signal. And now let's see how it sounds like with the other two voices. Let's close the cutoff a bit. Oh yeah! Very nice. So you see we can add a grit to the sound using marbles, also as a sound source if you're using audio rate signals or you're using marbles as an oscillator. And that's it guys, that was Marbles, also known as the random sampler. Go open VCV Rack, load up a few Marbles modules, kiss your social life goodbye and have fun. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe and hit the bell. And have a good one.